Good morning, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm Barry Pavel. I'm a Senior Vice President at the Atlantic Council and Director of the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this virtual discussion on security on the maritime edge, where we will explore threats and opportunities in maritime cybersecurity. The Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security develops sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and its close allies and partners. The center honors General Brent Scowcroft's legacy of service and embodies his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership in close cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. Today's discussion comes at a time of continuing mourning and reflection in the Scowcroft Center as we remember the life of our namesake, the late General Scowcroft, who passed away last month. General Scowcroft was an historic statesman who humbly lent us his name and helped define the mission of our center as a place that seeks to break from the day-to-day and focus instead on the longer-term questions and on strategies for addressing the greatest challenges facing the U.S. and U.S. allies. As the only two-time national security advisor, he helped presidents navigate one of the most tumultuous and complex periods in U.S. history, the end of the Cold War. He also established the model National Security Council decision process that all of his successors have sought to emulate, but none quite reached. Today, we're working to identify strategies for how the U.S. and its allies can better address systemic shortfalls in maritime cybersecurity. The global economy, as most of you know, is completely dependent on maritime shipping. 90% of all global trade goes by sea. It's the lifeblood of global energy networks, critical for global communications networks. But there are major growing challenges to maritime security. Today, we'll focus on the cyber domain, and those challenges are as yet unaddressed. And so the method we use in the Scowcroft Center is to try to focus on what should our longer-term strategic goals be regarding this set of questions, and then how do we develop a strategy to achieve those goals. Then we can get to work on the specific policy recommendations and related actions. One core principle for any such effective strategy, especially at the Atlantic Council, is to ensure, firstly, that the United States works closely with its core allies and partners in Europe and Asia and elsewhere. And secondly, that the public and private sector actors in government and industry are tightly coordinated to be able to most effectively protect our maritime infrastructure and operations in the cyber domain. For the energy sector, for example, the cybersecurity of systems from offshore renewable energy to fossil fuel transport, to floating production, storage, and offloading vessels, the whole system is an increasingly significant factor in the security of the energy ecosystem as a whole. So to that end, today's discussion will focus on not only how we can ensure the cyber safety of our ships, of our port facilities, but how this diverse community of private stakeholders, public sector stakeholders, can come together in a strategy to ensure the security of these systems for a longer term period. And so while vulnerabilities in widely used software and control systems are a concern, the greater source of risk is really systemic inadequacies in the public-private partnership for maritime cybersecurity and shortfalls of both capacity and coordination among critical stakeholders. So that's a lot. We're going to work through all this in this webinar. And so let me turn to Dr. Trey Hurt, the director of the Scowcroft Center's Cyber Statecraft Initiative, to further frame this discussion and introduce our really great panel. I'm looking forward to it, and thanks everyone again. Trey?
Excellent. Thank you, Barry. And thanks everybody for joining us. We've had a pretty tremendous turnout from around the world. So good morning to some of you, good afternoon to others, and hopefully good evening to very few of you. I think as Barry's laid this out really effectively, maritime cybersecurity is a critical topic. This is a vital and complex infrastructure for strategic relationships across the world, for the US and her allies in particular. And so what we want to do today is accomplish two primary goals. The first is to have an effective conversation about the threats and opportunities that exist in the maritime cybersecurity domain, to talk about the existing technical challenges, the policy challenges, and the strategic necessity of better addressing insecurity across the technical infrastructure, both IT and OT in this domain. The second is for the Atlantic Council and the Cyber Statecraft Initiative to announce our partnership with Idaho National Labs, which is going to be running through the next year to develop strategies to actually improve cybersecurity across all aspects of this infrastructure. So today's conversation is the kickoff to a much longer process. We look forward to engaging many of you as we go through. Lastly, I want to highlight that while maritime cybersecurity is the critical focus of today's conversation, it's actually one piece of the Cyber Statecraft Initiative's broader work on safety of edge computing systems. The Cyber Statecraft Initiative works diligently to bring together operational expertise with strategic insight, to have practitioners and strategic policymakers sitting at the same table addressing these thorny problems. And so while we're working and talking about maritime today, I would encourage you to also look at work that we've done on aerospace and aviation cybersecurity, as well as some upcoming events on grid and global energy security. With that, I'd like to introduce our opening speaker, Rear Admiral Mark Busby, who after retiring from the U.S. Navy in 2013 with 34 years of service, including nearly 4 years as commander of the U.S. Navy's Military Sealift Command, served as president of the National Defense Transportation Association before being sworn in and appointed as the Maritime Administrator on August 8, 2017. Rear Admiral, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you, Trey, and good day, everybody. Great to be with you here today. I'd like to first thank the Atlantic Council and compliment you for taking a leadership role in hosting this conversation. It's a very critical conversation that, quite frankly, is long overdue. A lot of people talk about cyber without really knowing what cyber is, and I think many of us have that aren't cyber experts per se, and don't have the technical background. It's easy for us just to kind of cast it off to the IT folks and say, go fix it. And I think what has become quite apparent over the last several years is that this truly needs an operational focus, truly needs a strategic approach to a very vexing and growing problem. With COVID-19, I think it's kind of accelerated the understanding amongst most people in the world just how critical our supply chains are and how integrated those supply chains are. And certainly in the case of the maritime world, the seagoing piece is just one part of our multimodal process that ties into trucking, and ties into rail, ties into the port operation, all of which have their vulnerabilities. And once you tie those all together and to make it an efficient supply chain, you've also just made it a very efficient path for ne'er-do-wells and bad actors to integrate into those systems in a bad way and cause chaos. And certainly we've seen examples of that both afloat in ships, in ports, and other parts of the multimodal system. So it's happening. It's not a maybe. It's not a I wonder if. It's a reality. And getting after this is absolutely vital, not only to our economic security, but really to our national security. So to the effect that we can get by gaining a better understanding across all of the modes, across all of those leaders that are in decision-making roles, I think it's absolutely critical. From where I sit here in the Maritime Administration, it's I look at it from both sides, obviously the economic side, but very much from the national security side as well, because so much of our maritime industry plays a critical role in the movement of our armed forces around the world that can be so easily disabled through some very simple keystrokes by some bad actors that introduces some true vulnerabilities into our national defense. So our industry partners, having you all a part of this is very, very critical. The information sharing aspects of it that clearly need to be better developed. And I fully understand the the business sensitivities of sharing information, but it's been done in other parts of business, and we clearly need to kind of get after it here and build that trust, quite frankly, between the government and industry, such that we can build a good, solid defense to enable the maritime industry to continue to grow, to go forward, and operate in that very dangerous neighborhood that's out there. I compliment the Atlantic Council for the great panel that you've pulled together here today, and I look forward to some very insightful and in-depth discussions coming forward here, led by Captain Tama, who has great experience in this area in his own port of New York. So with that, thanks very much, and welcome aboard.
All right, thank you, Admiral Busby, for the transition. And I want to thank the Atlantic Council for putting together this outstanding opportunity to advance the dialogue on this extremely important issue, and lending your voice and your platform to help us move forward and enhance awareness about some of the challenges that we face in the maritime domain with respect to cybersecurity. My name is Captain Jason Tama. I am the Coast Guard Sector Commander and Captain of the Port, Coast Guard Sector Commander and Captain of the Port of New York and New Jersey, here in New York. We're based in Staten Island, and we oversee the Port of New York and New Jersey and the offshore approaches from the Hudson River all the way up to Albany, all the way off to 200 miles offshore. We are charged with a very simple mission here, which is to ensure the safety and security of this port and to ensure that it stays open for business. And I have about 35 peers around the country that are also captains of the port in different ports all over the country, charged with the same mission. And that is the role that the Coast Guard plays in this space. Now, we've been doing this mission, ensuring the safety and security of our ports for hundreds of years. And we've done it in the physical domain for hundreds of years, literally, evolving our capabilities and our authorities to ensure the safety and security of our ports. We're now faced with this challenge of how do we do this in this new operational domain that is the cyber domain. And we've got a lot to learn on this front, and we've learned a lot over the past several years, but much more certainly needs to be done in this space for all of us, I think. The Coast Guard has very unique authorities in this space. We are an armed force, we're a regulatory agency, we're a law enforcement agency, and we're a member of the intelligence community, which gives us very unique capabilities and authorities that I think offer an opportunity for us to contribute and lead in the cyber domain. And we're starting to do that in places all over the country. But as I said, much more work needs to be done. Before I introduce our panelists, I just want to give a little bit of perspective on why maritime matters and why it's important from my perspective as the captain of the port here in New York and New Jersey. Just when we think about this port here, and there are many very important strategic ports for the United States, but when we think about this port in New York and New Jersey, 1/3 of the nation's GDP is generated within approximately 250 miles of this port. And in fact, when you look at the numbers, about $5 trillion, or almost a quarter of our nation's GDP, is related to the maritime transportation system and the products and goods and services that flow in and out of our country and domestically. So when we look how significant that is, the impact it has not only on a region like New York and New Jersey region, but also nationally, it's easy to understand why maritime matters. We have 360 ports in this country, over 20,000 bridges, 50,000 aids to navigation, 95,000 miles of shoreline. We are indeed a maritime nation. And trading in and out of those ports are thousands of ships that come from all over the world, far reaches of the world, 24/7, 365, as we heard in the intro, moving 90% of commerce throughout the globe. And this is an industry like every other industry out there that is increasingly dependent upon technology. Ships and facilities today cannot do what they do without their information technology and their operational technology being up and running. And we've seen some of the consequences or potential consequences of that from incidents like the NotPetya cyber attack, which was the most costly cyber attack in history and had a significant impact on some of the busiest ports in the country. And I'll just give you one example here before we introduce the panelists. You know, when we talk about reach, and I would argue as an entering position, I would just suggest that maritime is as important as other sectors that are recognized as key sectors for security in the cyber domain, as important as the financial sector, as important as the energy sector, as important as the communication sector when we look at reach and impact. And I'll give you one example. We are very fortunate to have partners in the financial sector here in New York that work with us on our Area Maritime Security Committee to help us improve cybersecurity here in the Port of New York and New Jersey. And when I speak to those leaders in the financial sector and I ask them, why are you working with us in the maritime domain? What's in it for you? And what they tell me is in the financial sector, we're in the business of market stability. And when we look at maritime, we look at disruption to the maritime supply chain as being a significant market mover. A significant disruption to the maritime transportation system is going to have significant impacts on our financial sector, on our economic output, on our communication sector, on our energy sector, a ripple effect across the United States and global economy. And our partners in the financial sector understand that, and they've put their best foot forward to help work with us and the maritime industry to help enhance cybersecurity. So I just offer that as a little bit of perspective from some of the work that we've been doing on the ground here in New York and New Jersey. With that, what I'd like to do is I'm really proud to introduce our panel members today. We have a fantastic panel of experts representing different perspectives from all over the world. And what I'm going to do is give each panelist an opportunity for a brief introduction to introduce themselves, wet your whistle a little bit with their perspective on this challenge of cybersecurity in the maritime domain. And also, I would ask the panelists to share a little bit of their perspective on this question of, you know, why does maritime matter? Why are we here today discussing cybersecurity challenges in the maritime domain? And we've got 5 panelists today. We have Ms. Kathy Metcalf, who's President and CEO of the Chamber of Shipping of America. We have Dr. Xavier Bellikins, who is a lecturer and Chancellor's Fellow at the Institute for Signal Sensors and Communications at the University of Strathclyde. We have Ms. Healy Tiramaklar, the Ambassador at Large for Cyber Diplomacy with the Estonian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We have Captain Alex Suhanov, Managing Director and Master Mariner of Moran Cyber. And we have Mr. Kevin Stein, Chief of the Applied Security Division at the National Institute of Standards and Technology with the U.S. Department of Commerce. So we've got great representation across public sector, private sector, academia, and of course from the international policy perspective. So really excited to hear from our panelists and get into what I know is going to be an interesting and stimulating dialogue today. So with that, why don't we start with Ms. Kathy Metcalf, President and CEO of the Chamber of Shipping of America. Go ahead, Kathy.
Thank you, Captain Tama, and thank you, Atlantic Council, for getting this together. I sort of look at myself as the least expert in cyber here, with all the great folks represented here. I'm coming to you, my perspective during this discussion is going to be that as from the mariner's perspective, keeping in mind that not only on board, but more importantly, the marine transportation system with its ever-increasing connectivity, as Admiral Busby mentioned, opens a number of new avenues and technologies by which harm can be done. So our perspective on this, why does maritime matter? Well, I think all the previous speakers have just hit it right on the head. not only is 90% of the world's goods carried by maritime, but we're also connected to a number of the other transportation systems, port and terminaling facilities. And so the system will only be as good as its weakest link. And taking that in mind, collaboration has got to be pursued for us all to get as healthy as we possibly can. I'll leave it at that right now, Captain Tama, and appreciate it.
Okay, thank you very much, Kathy, for that perspective. Great to have you there with your deep breadth of experience and broad breadth of experience in the maritime industry. Great to have you with us. We'll now turn it over to Dr. Xavier Bellikins. Go ahead, Doctor.
Thank you, Captain Tama. Thank you, Atlantic Council, for this opportunity. So I'm Xavier Bellikins, and my research group focuses on critical infrastructures, and part of those critical infrastructures, we have the maritime industry. So I've prepared a couple of slides just to give you a brief introduction of why maritime matters. And as you can now see, ships have a large variety of vessels. We've got different systems. We've got a lifespan of 30 years or more. We've got legacy systems, and we have many moving parts. Numerous critical infrastructures are also interconnected, and so a cyber attack against a maritime vessel or against the maritime industry could lead to a ripple effect. And quite often I'm being asked, how difficult is it to get information on a ship? So I put like here a couple of slides to give you an idea. And here we've got a ship. It's fairly easy to find. This was found through Shodan in a couple of minutes. We get access to the COMBOX. The COMBOX gives us information about the VSAT, Inmarsat, ICE. When we look a bit deeper, we get information about all of this, on how all of this is working. And we can learn very fast about our target. So, for example, I was lucky enough, I'm based in Scotland. The ship was next on the coast of Scotland. This was an amazing coincidence, but with a bit of open source intelligence, found the captain. I found information about the crew, the information about some of the instrumentation that was within the vessel. And I've been told when I gave this presentation a while back that this was one lucky example. So yesterday evening before this presentation, I went again and found many more. And as you can see, different information can be found for different ships. In this case, for example, we get the position of the ship, we get 4G information, and I then had a quick look at where the ship was, and basic Google search gave me the target, gave me a picture of the ship, and I could position the vessel in the sea. Now, you'll say, you understand how this is all being done, and I will argue that there are many other people that can do exactly the same. This is one basic tweet where we've got an entire community of people looking at maritime and doing open source intelligence. This was yesterday when a Russian warship collided with the ice rules ship, a merchant ship. This was picked up. A couple of minutes later, there were pictures, there were IP addresses also provided. And so this is why we actually need to have a look at cybersecurity, because nowadays we've got communities tracking ships, we've got communities tracking port operations, we've got many ways to gather open source intelligence, and it can either be done for the good of the people or for bad. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Xavier, for the introduction, and thank you for sharing some of the data that you found. It appears to be quite easily that you gathered that data, and I appreciate you illustrating that with us. We'll now go to Ambassador Taramakar, please, ma'am, welcome.
Hello. Good morning to you and good evening for those who are following us in Europe. I am speaking about how the cybersecurity is regulated in Europe because I was asked by the organizers to speak about the global perspective. So most of the NATO nations also belong to the European Union, and the European Union has set the civilian cybersecurity standards for all its member states. It's now 27 member states, and in 2016, the European Union has adopted the Network and Information Systems Security Communication and the Regulation. And the regulation asks all the member states to harmonize their own national laws and regulations in cybersecurity across all critical sectors, including the transport sector and including the maritime of the civilian ports and civilian maritime sector. So this actually is not a voluntary effort, it's mandatory. And the we call it NIS directive, so that's what I'm going to use now, but this is a broad European level regulation that has been setting benchmarks and standards how the member states should protect their cyber resilience. So this has set a certain legal framework. The legal framework in order to have national cybersecurity strategy in every country, the computer emergency response team, and also the contact point for cyber emergencies, and to make sure that the national cyber authority that each country is designated is also in charge of all the critical operations when it comes to operators of essential services. The European term for the critical infrastructure has been recently the operators of essential services. So these operators of essential services are required to take appropriate and proportionate security measures to manage risks in their systems. And also they are required to notify serious incidents to the relevant national authorities. So the notification and the severity level of incidents is up to all the nations to sign. So there is no one European level agreement on that. But of course, what this regulation has actually achieved was that all the countries in European Union actually pay attention to cyber resilience and cyber security. And all the countries had 2 years to implement it. So it was adopted in 2016, and countries had up to 2018 May to implement it. And now all the security standards for all these different sectors, including the maritime sector, of course, are still based on their own national regulation, but each nation has solved the issue of how they are setting those standards differently. And I can speak about my nation, Estonia. We have been mapping the critical services essential for our economy and national security already as early as 2009. We put all these essential services, including essential maritime services, into our national cybersecurity law. And there are quite clear-cut regulations what the companies are supposed to be doing in order to protect themselves and how long downtime they can afford, and what are the mandatory reporting guidelines also for the companies. And of course, we observe very different resilience and cyber systems in Europe. So some of them are more centralized, some of them are more public-private partnership based, some of them are more top-down. Estonian system is public-private partnership, which is quite voluntary, and the National Cyber Agency has been reaching out to the private sector operators and the ports and all the bigger maritime industry on the basis of kind of voluntary understanding, and we are offering trainings and different incentives to the private sector in order to make their own resilience a priority. So, And I think that this kind of approach has been working for us. But of course, there are different approaches that we can see. And I think the sector-specific approach of setting not mandatory standards always, but some sort of baseline security guidelines, and also facilitating the best practice exchange between the different entities and different companies. That might be also the way forward when it comes to what government can do and what the regulators can do to achieve more security in those critical areas for us. And of course, we have been observing in Europe also major security incidents in the ports, and they are mostly related to criminality. There was a famous incident where one of the large containers that contained narcotics actually was placed in a different place in a very large port, and that made it possible to ship it to Europe from some other countries. And these famous examples are there, how cybersecurity and the vulnerability of cybersecurity was used in order to aim the criminal activity. But those instances happened like 5-6 years ago. So hopefully then companies have taken a note there. And when it comes to the intersection of what actually EU does and what NATO does according to cyber standards, I think many of the military people always ask me, like, what's the role for the NATO? What NATO does? NATO is setting standards or setting security features for everything that is military related. And the EU is setting the guidelines and standards for everything which is civilian. So if there is an interface, so the national authorities, of course, need to then solve it. But as for majority of the ports, I think in Europe, those are still having a very civilian functions, at least in peacetime. And they fall under this European Union regulation, which is called the NIS directive. Of course, the NIS directive was a kind of baseline minimum security setting feature for European countries when it was adopted in 2016. And now there is a revision of this directive going on. And now there is a public consultation here in Europe going on, so where every country and every company can propose to some new ideas and new suggestions how to make this directive and legislation more effective. So I think it's a good time now also to insert some of these maritime security concerns in new pan-European legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, for those opening remarks and sharing the European perspective on international regulations and policy. Thank you very much. I'm now going to go to Captain Alex Suhanov, who's Managing Director and a Master Mariner with Moran Cyber. And just to give folks perspective, Alex is one of those few folks out there who I think is really helped bridging the gap between maritime professionals and cyber professionals, doing both quite well right now. Go ahead, Captain Suhanov.
Thank you, Captain Tama, and thank you everyone for having me. This is a wonderful presentation. I'm a professional navigator. Started off going to sea for 14 years, and my life in cyber started about 6 years ago when I was asked to help out on a cyber project to best understand whether or not navigation safety could be affected by cyber attack. And I haven't looked back. My life changed completely from that first project. It was a research project between teammates who were both mariners and then also cybersecurity professionals and understood shipboard systems and operational technology. And the background is that first assessment results were so compelling that the owner said, let's take this and anonymize it and bring it to the Ship Owners Association. From there, we've had some great support from within industry to create a larger sample set of work and to expand the body of work, which then moved off onto other projects like ports and terminals and in business. So we were able to connect the dots and specialize and do this work. One area of knowledge that we've been able to build in significantly over the last few years is in and around marine terminals and ports. We conducted a project over a large number of terminals in one port over the last couple of years, and it was an amazing experience, not just for us, but particularly for the stakeholders themselves. And really the larger impact was that it brought in not just themselves, but also third parties and their partners and all the other essential businesses that are really what makes Maritime what it is. It's a global community of businesses doing work together. And so look forward to the panel discussion, and thank you for having me.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Captain Suhanov. We're now going to go to our last panelist for a quick intro, Mr. Kevin Stein, Chief of Applied Cybersecurity Division at the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. Go ahead, Kevin. Great to have you.
Hey, thank you very much, and good morning. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in the panel today, and I really appreciate the expertise and the experiences of fellow panelists, really with their deep experience in the maritime space. I certainly come at this not from a maritime perspective, but really from a cybersecurity perspective, and how we can take cybersecurity experiences, standards, guides, and tools and really apply them in the context of the maritime. I certainly come at this not from a maritime perspective, environment. You know, when Admiral Busby was providing his opening remarks, he used a very important term: cybersecurity experiences, standards, guides, and tools. That word was trust. You know, at NIST, we're a non-regulatory agency within the U.S. Department of Commerce, and really our purpose, if you will, from a cybersecurity perspective, is really to seek to cultivate trust. We try to do that through, at NIST, we're in technology and measurement science that can help to build trust in data and information in the maritime environment. You know, when he was providing his opening remarks, an important term. That word was systems and technologies, really with an eye towards helping organizations and sectors, and in many cases nations, better understand and manage risk in the context of their missions and their business objectives. A standard. And we seek to use very open and transparent and collaborative process, really with an eye towards sectors, much like maritime, as we've already heard this morning. Very diverse stakeholders across all the different dimensions of this sector. So having that open and collaborative approach is clear. You know, this trust is especially critical in this space, given, again, those many areas of interconnectivities and really the convergence, if you will, from so many domains. You know, we've heard this is a national security issue as well as an economic security issue. You have diverse public and private stakeholders that are involved and play key roles across the entire maritime space. You have that technology convergence, as Admiral Busby mentioned, of the information technologies and the operational technologies and other types of sensors and connected devices that really play an important role. And I'd say you also have a convergence of workforce. You've got IT professionals and security folks. You've got the operational technology experts that really understand the maritime space and how those things are applied. How do we bring these communities together, kind of bridge communications and technology gaps in some ways, or bridge those areas of potential disconnect, really to align around a common goal and really cultivating trust in these types of environments? I think that diversity and that complexity within the maritime space really requires that collaborative approach, and quite honestly, it requires a risk-based approach. So I'm looking forward to not only the discussion today, but really, you know, bringing many of the NIST resources to bear to help improve the cybersecurity in the maritime space, and really in collaboration with you. And I think we'll be able to talk more about those over the resulting the rest of this panel. So thank you again.
Great. Thank you, Kevin, for those introductory words. And we appreciate the great work that NIST has been doing in this space across all of our critical infrastructure sectors here in the United States. Before I start with some questions for the panel, I do want to just make a public service announcement, if you will. For those of you that do have your own questions for any of the panelists, please feel free to use the chat room. You can chat those in on Zoom, and we will be taking those questions here towards the end of the panel. And we look forward to hearing your questions and comments and engaging the panelists in that manner. So I think, you know, what we wanted to do with this discussion is start with, you know, why does maritime matter? And I think we set the table for that between certainly Admiral Busby's remarks and our opening remarks with our panelists. And I'd like to talk a little bit about characterizing risk. And risk, of course, is a function of threat, vulnerability, and consequence. So I'd like to do a couple questions on that, and then we'll talk a little bit about what do we do about this. And I'd like to hear from the panelists on what some steps are, both near term and strategically, that we can take. And then we will open this up for Q&A from our diverse audience around the world. So let's talk about risk. And I don't think we're going to spend a lot of time on threat because I think with the number of the well-informed audience that we have here with the Atlantic Council, I don't think in 2020 I need to convince too many people about the cyber threats that are out there from both nation states, hacktivists, cyber criminals, transnational crime, etc. But I'd like to use the time to talk a little bit about vulnerabilities. And I guess the question that I have for our panelists, and I think we'll start with Alex on this one, is and I know you touched on it, but I wonder, Captain Suhanoff, if you can just characterize vulnerabilities in the maritime domain. What makes is the maritime domain any more or less vulnerable from other sectors from your perspective?
Yeah, so maritime, it's very unique. I think the easiest way to characterize this is in this way. Ships have been built over the years with very stern safety requirements in mind. And if you think about how a ship is built and how it's compartmented and broken into sections, and so if there's ever a safety issue at sea, particularly if the hull is the flooding to those spaces can be controlled through compartmentalization. And that's been that way for many, many years. But the problem is with cyber and with networks on board is that over the last 30 years, these networks seem to have been deployed and installed without the equivalent of that kind of compartmentalization, which we call segmentation in IT and cybersecurity. And so something very prominent we see in the assessment work that we do and remediation is the lack of that kind of protection and segmentation, but also the prioritization of security by design from the beginning.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Great perspective. Very challenging when you're deploying a capital asset that may navigate the sea for 30 years. And to maintain that IT and OT integration and the network segmentation. And I like the analogy of compartmentalization, which ships have been designed for years to avoid sinking. So how do you get that compartmentalization in the cyber domain? Let me ask Kevin to weigh in on the same question, because I know NIST is doing work across all different sectors. Kevin, do you have any thoughts on vulnerabilities in the maritime domain that make maritime particularly unique?
Yeah, I mean, I think maritime, much like many other sectors and probably all sectors and organizations, look, you're dependent upon technology. You certainly have diverse environments where you have a great combination of legacy and non-legacy technologies and platforms and environments. And I think those all present different unique challenges, but certainly where we're using technology in the form of software and hardware, those technologies are not going to be free from vulnerabilities. So making sure that we understand how they're being used, understand that their use for purpose, if you will, within to help accomplish a mission or a business objective. And understanding really the impact should those types of technologies will have, if there are challenges that will have on the mission and the business objectives of in the diverse parts of this sector and environment are going to be key. And I think recognizing that you have that diversity of technology, you have that diversity of the operational environments, whether it's on ship or at port, and the port technologies, and that mix of the legacy and kind of the newer and highly connected environments is going to be very important.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Thank you very much for that perspective. And let me bring Kathy into the conversation here from the perspective of the maritime industry itself. And Kathy, you have admittedly not a cyber expert, but certainly a maritime expert. And I guess the question I would ask you is, from the perspective of the maritime industry, do you think our leaders in the maritime industry have an understanding of the threats and the vulnerabilities? Do they understand and appreciate what's at stake here? Go ahead, Kathy.
Thank you, Captain. Yes, I do. Now it's the old adage, you don't know how much you're going to miss something until you no longer have it. And I look at a cyber incident much like that. You're used to your onboard systems operating in a certain way, your communication systems to and from shore and ports. You don't really realize how important it is when you don't have it available. So I think as we see a number of maritime related cyber attacks and the press, yes, I think the onboard crew gets it, but and I also think the very high level senior management gets it. I'm not sure if the middle management, say the shore based management, is getting it other than their IT group. But I think with every incident we get much closer to people realizing what can happen. Initially, people looked at cyber as a real dangerous cyber attack was somebody takes control of a ship and for one of a better bridge, captain steers it into the Verrazano Narrows Bridge. That is what I would call the ultimate concern. But I think what we've got to educate better on is it doesn't have to be quite that dynamic for it to have a significant impact on a shipping company and the marine transportation system, such as an economical impact.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. And no, that's a great perspective. I think we read about the doomsday scenarios that you just articulated, but I don't think, as you said, I think a disruption could be much simpler and perhaps as severe in many respects. And let me just ask one follow up. I mean, shipping companies and facilities, they understand operational risk. They have some of the most dynamic and challenging operational risks that they manage all the time, 24/7, 365, whether it's navigation, weather, labor disruptions, pollution events, geopolitical challenges. Should we look at cyber, and is the industry looking at cyber as an operational risk another operational risk that needs to be managed? Is that the right way to look at this?
Absolutely. It's the only way to really look at it from the shipboard side. I mean, obviously, you're looking at the highest levels of a company through middle management, various technical expertise, and then the onboard members of the crew. And so I think what we've got to understand is, as you are aware, and most are probably already, there's been fairly extensive discussions at the International Maritime Organization. There's also a set of cyber guidelines that was put out by an industry roundtable of international associations, spearheaded in large part by the organization called BEMCO. And the ultimate decision, and following along your question, Captain, is cybersecurity has got to be integrated into the ISM planning, that all the International Safety Management Code that covers all these other issues, operational issues, contingency issues, and contingency planning, which I think is the most important. I will say one thing though. If I'm in the middle of the ocean and I lose a system, my first question is not going to be, is this a cyber problem? My first question is going to be, how can I restore my operational capability to make sure I'm safe and not an environmental risk? The cyber question comes after that initial response is under control.
Great, thank you, Kathy. And to those that are submitting questions to the chat, we see them. Thank you very much, and we'll start working through some of those questions here in a few minutes. Thanks for that perspective, Kathy. So let's just pull the thread a little bit more on vulnerabilities, and then we're going to transition to a couple other areas. But let me pull the thread a little bit more on vulnerabilities, and this relates to some of the questions we are getting from the chat. Which one of the questions was, hey, what's the attack surface that we're talking about? Are we talking about ships? Are we talking about ports? Help us understand what the attack surface is from a vulnerability perspective. And let me go to, and I promise to get the other panelists in as well, but let me go back to Alex on this one, because I think you've done the most work on this group, specifically in the maritime domain. I wonder, Alex, how you could most simply explain the attack surface and the vulnerabilities.
Yes, so the surface is literally anything that's now connected. And earlier we talked about the ship's networks. That surface has increased because of cyber physical systems like engines, navigation systems, cargo management systems, and then also in the ports, other forms of industrial control systems and operational technologies. That surface is expanding because of globalization, because this is the way industry is going. And it's a means to optimize and run more efficiently. But to that end, the surface expands with more equipment and more systems connected. And the who's on the other end of that in terms of the adversary all have the same net effect in terms of safety for us on ships and in the ports. And it really doesn't matter who the bad guy is. It could have the same net effect on operations.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And let me just go real quick to close out the vulnerability discussion. Back over to Scotland, to Xavier. Xavier, what's your perspective as somebody that's done work across many different sectors on a very technical level? Do you see maritime as any more or less vulnerable than other sectors?
So, well, maritime is as vulnerable as other sectors. I think we've started looking at cybersecurity in the maritime sector a bit later than other sector. I don't know why, even though the maritime sector has the same impact as other sector, or can be impacted the same way as other sectors. And now we've got this all, like as Kevin mentioned, the legacy systems. Kathy mentioned the crew as well, and Alex mentioned, like Captain Alex mentioned, the fact that we've got all of these systems that are interconnected together. And interestingly enough, we don't seem to pay attention at the full chain of elements, right? We don't only have like the systems, we have a crew, the crew rotates, we have the systems that come from third parties, and we've got to secure those systems, we've got to train the crew. We have like managers, like when cargo ships come in a port and exchange USB keys. So we've got to look at the maritime sector as a whole, and as a whole, the maritime sector is very vulnerable because of all of those small moving parts, right? And I think once we will start looking as a whole and understanding the effects of a cyber attack against the sector in general, then we'll be able to move forward. And we can take the lessons of other sectors and apply it to the maritime sector. For example, a couple of days ago, we learned about like the first death of a cyber attack in Germany. And we've got to take those lessons in the health and care sector and apply it to the maritime sector.
Yes, thank you, Xavier, and I appreciate the perspective on cross-sector collaboration. It's something that we've been pushing very hard here in New York. So many lessons learned from other sectors, and I would just emphasize what you said, and that's what we've heard from our work here on the ground in New York and New Jersey with experts and some of the assessment work that we've done. That your point that maritime's coming to this a little bit later. That they're years behind some of the other sectors that have were brought to the forefront through some of the challenges that they face both nationally and internationally. So let's and again, we see the questions coming in, and I'm going to work those in as we continue the discussion. So thank you all very much. I want to transition to what do we do about it, and that's the nature of a lot of the questions that are coming in, and. So what do we do about this? And I think I'll go back to the ambassador to lead off this question, because from your perspective in Estonia and from your perspective in Europe, clearly you've emphasized that the regulatory approach is the approach that the EU is currently taking. Obviously, here in the United States, a different approach right now from a regulatory perspective, where certainly on the maritime side, we have not moved as a country, and in many other sectors have not moved yet towards a new regulatory framework for cybersecurity. So I would ask Ambassador if you could talk about, from your perspective, next steps and why regulation is the answer in Europe.
Well, thank you for this question. So, why regulation is as an approach in Europe? I think it's a more philosophical question, because we in Europe we like to regulate. So, but one of the calculus or one of the reasons why this NIS directive was adopted was the very different preparedness across the EU member states towards cyber threats. So the cyber threats, of course, are perceived by everybody, but as you as a cyber expert would know, you can't smell it, you can't touch it, you can't know it unless there is either economic loss or a conflict in cyberspace and so on. And not all European nations are at the same level of understanding cyber threat and also dealing and addressing cyber threat. I think this regulation, in a way, tries to create a level playing field amongst the nations here. So, because this is, we are not a federal state in European Union. We are still different member states trying to do something together. It's not a federal system like the US. So each of us has our own president, our own parliament, so on. So we are just states cooperating with each other. But there are some economic and some regulations, and the idea behind the cyber regulation was to also help the internal market and economies of all those member states to grow. And the regulation on cyber is not the standard level, this is ISO standard this or ISO standard that type of regulation. It's more the compulsory attention of those member states who have not done their due diligence in cyberspace to pay attention to cyber threats and to have the necessary national systems in place in order to guard the critical infrastructure, and also to have the public-private partnership and all sorts of cooperation frameworks in place on national level. So in a way, it's a bit like a meta level regulation where the European Union tells the member states to take cyber seriously and tells which sectors are those sectors, and transport and maritime is one of those sectors. So I think so it's not saying like all those whatever ships need to have one type of navigation system. No, it's not this kind of regulation. It's more the regulation as a standard of security or a risk. Helps all these member states to cooperate, because if there is a incident in port in Tallinn and there is the same incident in port in Greece, they actually have a network now in place that they can talk to each other. So I think that's useful. And all these large ports, of course, and all the sectors within the one economic sector, like in maritime sector, all the different entities and companies, they can, I think, because of this European level coordination structure, they can more easily find partners and share best practice and talk to each other.
Thank you for that, and thank you for the clarification on the regulatory approach. And I think I would state how we would call that approach in the Coast Guard, and how we talk about regulation is your regulations are not prescriptive. They're not prescribing a specific, as you said, a specific standard or methodology, because we know, I think, it's impossible to do that given the pace of change from a technology perspective. Yeah. And I'll give you just one follow-up on this, and you can respond to what I said here as well. But and what about reporting? You talked about mandatory reporting, and this is a question that came up in the chat as well. How do we incentivize private sector to report. And it sounds like the EU is going with mandatory reporting. And do you see this as effective? And do you have any data that tells you that that the private sector is reporting? Because certainly there are many complex barriers to reporting cyber incidents. Back to you. Go ahead. Thank you.
First of all, there is no EU level reporting. Each nation needs to set up its own reporting system. So, and I think how they do this is up to them. The EU has different layers of how they prescribe different steps in their internal regulation. And if it's legal framework called directive, it means that the member state can still choose how the member state is implementing those principles which are in the EU-wide directive. So mostly it means that majority of the member states have this mandatory reporting to CERT, the National Computer Emergency Response Team. Prior to the NIS directive, not all nation states or member states in Europe had one designated national CERT, but they might have several or so. But now there is clear which is a national CERT. This national CERT cooperates with other CERTs in other member states, and all the regional or sometimes there are also federal countries in Europe, federal or the sectoral CERTs then report to the national CERT. So of course the question is how the police gets this information and whether the companies would be then disincentivized to report because they would know that government would maybe open the police investigation, and of course this is sometimes that the companies might not see very favorably. Again, this is up to each nation to solve it, how they have done it. And I think the law enforcement cooperation with the resilience or cybersecurity community has improved here, because we had witnessed in Europe very serious ransom attacks against some of the major utilities and also the transport companies. And those have diminished recently, so which is a good sign. And this kind of law enforcement cooperation with the resilience community, this of course would be always much more efficient and better, but this has improved. But so each nation has its own system, how they solve this reporting. Short answer.
Okay, yes, thank you for the clarification on that. Not an EU requirement. Each nation has their own framework for this, and I think you touched on the barriers to reporting, which we know are significant. And I can say from the Coast Guard perspective, this is a challenge. We have requirements in place to report hazardous conditions on board ships that we've had in place for decades. We have a very good relationship with the maritime industry to report a hazardous condition. I think that area can get gray and blurry very quickly in the cyber domain. Let me go. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Let me go as we talk about what do we do about this. Let me go back to Kathy Metcalf from the ship owner operator perspective. Kathy, is regulation the answer here? Is that the right step here in the United States from your perspective, or is it something else?
I think it's a combination probably in the long run. It was good to understand the EU program from Heli, but keep in mind what my members need is a level of detail that you can't create in a regulatory process. And as Heli mentioned so wisely, it is, recognizes certain vulnerable sectors. It recognizes certain basic things that you need to look at. But at some point, we've got to jump from the general to the detail. How do we actually meet those requirements on a ship? What systems, what connections, what culture changes do we need? What education do we need? And I think it's a lot like the ISM code, which is a very general set of requirements, but that gets this flesh put on the bones at the ship level on, all right, how do I integrate this plan into our onboard operations. So I think regulation at the general level is not a problem, but it's the challenge is implementing it effectively on a ship. And keep in mind that all ships are not the same. Hopefully they all float, but if you look at not only the ship type, the sector, the voyage and transit routes, as well as the commercial agreements between a ship owner and, say, for example, a charter and terminals. So to get to that level of detail, I don't think you could possibly write a regulation. I think you can set out some general principles in a regulatory program, which I would urge everyone that the right place for this is the IMO. It's not within each individual country, because ships, as you know, are traveling all over, and to have a different set of requirements and standards on a country or national basis just is very difficult to comply with. So we need some kind of global program. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. And for those that don't know, the IMO, it's the International Maritime Organization, similar to the ICAO that provides international standards for global aviation trade. The IMO is the body that does this for maritime. Thanks. And then real quick, Kathy, I'm going to come right back to you to get a question from the audience. And I'll just ask you, and we're running short on time, just a quick answer. What about maritime? What about cyber insurance? What about cyber insurance? Is that an area that you see growing in applicability and adoption in the maritime domain, and can that help?
Yes, yes. There you go. I'm no expert on insurance issues, but it is a very hot topic of discussion within the maritime insurance community. And stay tuned, because I think you're going to see some new or different kinds of insurance cover or lack thereof for cyber.
Great, thank you. And let me go back to Kevin Stein on this issue of what do we do about this and what's next. And Kevin, and I'm going to try to get one more panelist in as well after your response, but I wonder if you can just talk from the NIST perspective. And I know NIST is always walking a fine line between regulation, guidance, framework. What from your perspective, what are the next steps? What needs to be done to help improve the cyber resiliency in the maritime domain?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And you're right, we do walk that fine line. We are a non-regulatory organization. Certainly our approaches and the engagements we have are really focused or formed around that notion of that collaborative partnership with all the different stakeholders. We've actually worked recently with the different parts of the maritime sector, most recently within the last few years, working with Coast Guard colleagues, and industry participants focus around really cybersecurity considerations and challenges in the bulk liquid transfer environment. We learned focus from different stakeholders. We've learned a lot through that. And so much, in fact, we're going to be launching a new effort soon, working again with Coast Guard colleagues, Department of Energy colleagues, as well as hopefully with working with many of you and across the industry, to really take a look at the cybersecurity challenges, considerations in port operational technology environment. So really understanding the port operations from the perspective of the use of operational technologies, and really trying to understand the cybersecurity needs and priorities, kind of to what Kathy said, kind of going down to that slightly lower level of detail where we get a little bit more actionable, if you will, and better to really take a little detail where we get a little bit more stakeholders in this space, kind of the owners and the operators, if you will, really implement cybersecurity in a very meaningful way that's aligned with the mission and the business processes that they have to execute. And I think the intent there is really to have a very flexible and outcome-based approach to really be responsive to the diverse needs of the different community parts.
Yeah, great. Yeah, great. Thank you. Flexible.
That's aligned with the mission.
Thank you. Flexible and outcome-based approach. I think appropriate words for the cyber domain, and excited to hear that NIST is moving forward with some port-specific work. I think that's a great initiative. You know, and that gets to one of the questions from the audience, and when we get back to what's the attack surface and so forth. And I think it's important for people to remember how integrated the supply chain is. And I use New York as an example. yes, you could take control of a ship and do some type of disruption. But a disruption can be just as significant, if not more significant, if you clog up the facility or the terminal and make them unable to offload containers, for instance, or receive fuel, and you immediately disrupt, have a ripple effect through the entire supply chain, not only on the maritime side, but on the rail, on the trucking side, on the other end. Real quick before we close it out, let me just go back to Captain Suhanov and give you one last word here in the couple minutes we have left on your perspective on what do we need to do about it, as both a professional mariner and somebody looking at the cyber vulnerability space. Go ahead.
Yeah, right. So holistic strategies coming from the top to the bottom is what's needed. And that's what we've observed to work very well and be very effective coming from the sea level down through the organization. The shoreside support for the vessels is absolutely critical. And we were part of a large project over several years that where we were able to learn and observe that. That prioritization from the top down makes all the difference in the world, and it unifies the organization across departments into that piece, particularly because of the expanding attack surface, going into third parties, extensive partnerships with software providers, technology providers, and other business partners, but also because with digitalization comes a whole new slew of new technologies and sensors. And all those want to get out and talk to the internet, and there needs to be strategies that are built in with the company's aims and larger goals. But it can work, and it does work when it's done right.
Roger that. And in 30 seconds or less, for a cyber incident on a ship, this was one of the questions from the audience. Do we have mariners that are equipped to deal with that, and that we know most ships aren't sailing with IT professionals or cybersecurity professionals?
We're doing our very best to put the word out there to help mariners on this. I can't speak for every company and every ship, but to reemphasize again, the support has to come from shore, because they don't have the background and the expertise on board to do this. It really has to come from shoreside. With a plan, and then have very simple instructions for the master and the crew as to what those steps are, and then the practice to it.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Alex. Thank you very much. Okay, I think we're gonna start wrapping this up here. I'll just provide just a couple closing comments, and I really appreciate the different perspectives from the panelists. We could talk for another 2 hours on this topic on, why does maritime matter, and really dig into some of the vulnerabilities and consequences. And certainly we could have a rich and deep discussion on what to do about it. And I think we primed that pump with this dialogue today, and I appreciate that. And the last thought that I'll share from a Coast Guard perspective is, when we look at a ship coming into this port, I can look at almost any ship in the world, and our team has the ability to very quickly discern, assess the level of safety and security on that ship in the physical domain. We do it every day, 24/7, 365, every port around the United States, and internationally this is done. The standards are there. The training requirements are there, the educational requirements are there. We can make a baseline assessment of risk on whether or not to allow that ship into port. We have no such capability right now in the cyber domain, just to illustrate that point, and I think all the panelists would certainly agree on that. With that, I'm going to thank you all for the opportunity, and thank all the panelists in the Atlantic Council, and I will turn it back to Trey with the Atlantic Council to close things out. Thank you all very much, and have a great day.
Excellent. Thank you, Captain Tam, and thank you everybody for joining us today. In listening to this, I really like Kathy's, interjection, right? You don't know what you've got till it's gone. And so thinking about the severity of the potential consequences in this industry, thinking about the diversity of stakeholders that have to play a key role, not only in driving the adoption of standards, but collaborating in the management of risk and in the response to crises, I think there's a lot of good work to be done here. There's some interesting lessons to be learned from other areas, other complex, both OT and IT mixed domains that are trying to address these challenges, but also some really unique challenges to this domain specifically. The big takeaway I think that I heard from the discussion is that there's some really useful distinctions to be drawn between the Hollywood scenarios of the threat and our much more diverse and subtle array of real world risks. And so I look forward to working with all of you, and I think many of the folks on the line on addressing those and trying to craft a more coherent strategy for the US and our allies and partners in the private sector on this issue here in the forthcoming year. Thank you again to Rear Admiral Busby for his remarks, to you, Captain Tama, for moderating an excellent panel, and to our panelists again for sharing your thoughts and your time with us. We appreciate everybody coming out. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.